Amen. So thank you again for this opportunity to participate in this conversation with you. This, for some, has been a season of uncertainty, a season of many questions and a whole lot of information out there, conflicting, some true, some not so true, some definitely not so true. And so I understand from Pastor Patty and Pastor Virginia and your leaders that there was a desire to discuss the denominational issues that we're facing. As I've been asked by other congregations in our conference to do something similar and have been part of these conversations, being a member of the cabinet and conference staff since 2015, I offered my assistance. To let you know where I hope we go in this time, I want to spend the first 30 to 45 minutes with some prepared remarks to lay a foundation and cover some of what I can. And I want to talk briefly about how we got to this point, what the future is for the United Methodist Church and for our conference, and discuss some options churches have in this season. But I know my remarks are not going to cover everything, so we're going to have a time for question and answer so that you can ask me anything. Really, anything will go. I'm guessing we're going to be here about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, depending on how inquisitive you are. So if you need to step out, please do so. Take a bathroom break if you need or whatever. If you need to slip out early because of other obligations, I fully understand. No offense taken. To trust the message, it's helpful to know a bit about the messenger. And as Pastor Patty said, I serve as the Superintendent of Congregational and Community Vitality. It is one of the longest titles known to humankind. I helped make that title, and I've regretted it ever since taking it on for my own, right? Prepare what you ask for, right? I did serve as a district superintendent for the whole state of Wyoming for 5 years before coming to this position. I'm now in my 3rd year in this position. And before that, I served as a pastor for churches in Wyoming, in rural Colorado, and in Arkansas, which is where my home is originally. I have a degree in addition to my Master of Divinity from Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. I have a degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Missouri-Rolla. You can ask me later how I got from one to the other. It is an interesting story. I talk to God about that a lot. I say, if you were going to call me to this, why couldn't I have had fun in college? I don't. That's right, We still need rocket scientists, so here I am. What else can I say to tell you about myself? Well, let me try this on. I'm a 3rd-generation Methodist, and I would describe myself as Wesleyan, theologically orthodox, politically progressive, high Christology, sacramentally minded Trinitarian. Now, why do I say all that? I say all that to remind us of the point that even in any argument, there is more than one way to slice the pie. And there is always more than two sides to any argument. So, where do we begin? United Methodists are known for our jargon and our long titles and our acronyms and our nomenclatures. Still, there's probably a few or many here today who are not 3rd-generation Methodists. So I've been asked to give a brief primer on United Methodism, and I think that's a good idea. So first, let's get a little perspective. As I was doing research, I found this amazing picture. And it's really small to see, but if you look at that, that is someone's creation of the tree of all world religions. All world religions, right? Look at that thing. Now, what's fascinating is we're just that little group near the orange arrow down on one side. That is the Wesleyan family. And in fact, the United Methodist Church is only one strand of that broad tree, right? All those branches, all those places that you can see or imagine where one stream becomes two, were religious moments in that faith tradition very similar to what we're facing right now. Which is to say, we're not going through anything new. This has been something that happens, good or bad, along the way of religious life. So the history of the Wesleyan movement is filled with partings and unions, just as the history of world religions. Our particular Wesleyan family started in the 1730s as a movement within the Anglican Church led by John and Charles Wesley and a few other folks at Oxford University, seeking a spiritual revival within the Church of England. This desire for revival was also felt in other spheres, other places in the world, including a German pietist movement that would become the Evangelical Church and United Brethren Church in Christ, two other churches that became a part of the Methodist family later on. Now, the Methodist movement found its legs in the United States in 1784 with the formation of the Methodist Episcopal Church, led by Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, sent to America with John Wesley's blessing to start a new church because this little thing happened called the Revolutionary War. And they needed a church that wasn't related to England anymore. Now, only a few years later, that was 1784, only a few years later, the United States adopted a new document to govern the new country, the United States Constitution. Why do I bring this up? Because when we think of the polity, the governing structure of the United Methodist Church, there are many parallels between the United Methodist Church and the United States government. The ecclesial structure of the United Methodist Church is, and let's go to the next slide, I think it may have gotten off a bit. There we go. All those circles, that's us, right? That's us. So the ecclesial structure of the United Methodist Church is very much like the government of our country, a federal system with legislative, executive, and even judicial branches. So it's a tiered system, much like ours, and at the local municipal level is the local church or charge. And then, as a gathering of local churches, next up is the annual conference. The Mountain Sky Annual Conference being one, that is ours. And it is a gathering of delegates, laity, and clergy from across a region. For ours, 4 states and 1 county in Idaho: Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and 1 county in Idaho. The annual conference gathers every year as the legislative body of our annual conference. At annual conference is when we pass legislation, when we pass our rules, change our rules, anything of the like. Now, the bishop, the cabinet, the staff, and all of our committees and teams are the executive body of the annual conference. So, local church, annual conference, you go up one more level to the jurisdictional conference, which is a gathering of annual conferences in a larger region. We are part of the Western jurisdiction. Now, the jurisdictional conference's primary responsibility is to gather every 4 years to elect bishops that will serve within the jurisdiction. Then finally, at the top level, the worldwide level, is the General Conference. And the General Conference is our highest legislative body, much like Congress, and except that it's worldwide. And it gathers every 4 years to make changes to our laws, our governing policies, and the like. General Conference is a 4-year gathering. It's our legislative body. We also have all the bishops, the general boards and agencies, and the teams that are part of the general church are the executive branch of our government. And finally, we have a judicial council, which on the national level is our church's only standing judicial branch that rules on actions of the church. Now, I want to highlight the General Conference for this conversation. As I mentioned, this is a gathering of delegates from every annual conference and central conference across the globe that meets every 4 years to revise our Book of Discipline. Our Book of Discipline, which is our governing law book for our church, which includes a wide variety of materials, including laws and rules for how a church operates, what is expected of the clergy, our fundamental beliefs, and the social principles and more. It's really been statements in the Book of Discipline that have been the focus of the debate over human sexuality in which we find ourselves today. Because it's coming up soon, I want to highlight our bishops and the jurisdictional conference. Now, bishops are our spiritual leaders and executive officers for every annual conference and within the whole church. And as I mentioned, bishops are elected at jurisdictional conference, and bishops serve for life. They are bishops for life and serve until mandatory retirement of 72. And right now, we are in the season of discernment for electing new bishops. Jurisdictional conference will meet November 2nd through 5. The Western jurisdiction will meet. We are hosting. Our conference is hosting in Salt Lake City to elect 3 new bishops this quadrennium, because 3 bishops will be retiring and exiting active service. Now, that was a whole lot to take in just a few minutes, but I hope it gives you a sense of the governance of our church. In general, you can find an analog for everything within our church, similarly within the United States governance system. And so it's really only a matter of, mapping the new words to what you know within the civic system of our country. So with that brief primer, let's turn to today's topic. We find ourselves in a challenging season for our church. And I will share with you that I grieve this season because I love the United Methodist Church, and I always have. And I have loved every of its many expressions that I have experienced through my years and through the many places that I have lived and served. Yet, I also believe this has become a necessary season for our church. How did we get here? First, let's acknowledge there have been disagreements in the church on human sexuality for a long time. But for the United Methodist Church, this debate entered a new phase in 1972, with language added to the newly crafted social principles. 1972 was 4 years after the merger that formed the United Methodist Church. And the social principles were being created. And at first, there was going to be a pastoral statement about human sexuality and the place of the LGBTQ community within the church. But on the floor of the General Conference of 72, that was turned from a pastoral statement into a prohibitive statement. And from that moment, positions began to harden, and the denomination became increasingly polarized. In 1976, 4 years later, minority voices within the Methodist Church were silenced by cutting off funding and the official status of any group in favor of supporting full inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Although the incompatible language was a part of our discipline, it was not until 1984 that the ordination of LGBTQ persons was forbidden. And it was only in 1992 that same-sex unions were banned. Some responses were made in 2000, 2008, and 2012 to try to soften the language or at least understand the full diversity of our church. But the polarity and division continued until in 2012, the General Conference could not even acknowledge that we were in disagreement as a church. Now, many times since 1972, schism has been discussed and often at the last moment averted as positions hardened through the years. What we don't have time to go into, but is still important to understand, were the changes in our society and our world, including the initial successes of the civil rights movement, the infiltration of the religious fundamentalism into politics, and the birth of the civil rights movements for the LGBTQ community, as well as other historically marginalized communities. One internal factor that has also been instrumental in the history of this debate and disagreement has been the growth of the United Methodist Church in areas outside of the United States, particularly in Africa and the Philippines. So even as most American United Methodists have come to affirm the full inclusion of the LGBTQ community, the shift has been offset by increasing numbers of conservative-leaning delegations from Africa and other central conferences. Finally, in 2016, the debate entered a new phase, with General Conference asking the bishops to lead and the bishops forming the Commission on a Way Forward. The Commission proposed the One Church Plan, which would have given churches, pastors, and annual conferences autonomy in their spheres to decide on matters of human sexuality. But the plan was voted down at General Conference 2019 in place of a very rigid traditionalist plan, which also included paragraph 2553, a means for churches to disaffiliate, to leave the United Methodist Church. Now, I actually attended as an observer General Conference 2019. And what I observed at its end is that all parties involved, those that won and those that lost, but all parties involved, I think, realized that what happened there was not a solution for our future. So almost immediately afterwards, negotiations between key stakeholders began, which led to what has been called the Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace Through Separation. In this protocol, the traditionalist churches represented by the Wesley Covenant Association and other organizations would choose to separate, and a lower threshold for disaffiliation was proposed. The protocol was to be considered at General Conference 2020, but then the pandemic came, and General Conference was delayed three times. Let's see, so here's my notes, yep. And has now been delayed until at least 2024. So the next General Conference will be in 2024. And since then, the protocol has actually lost some of its backing and is likely not to pass even in 2024. So with the last announcement, which was on March 3rd of this year, the WCA chose to move up its timeline and form the Global Methodist Church starting May 1st and begin what is becoming the split in the United Methodist Church. Since then, annual conferences have been working with churches interested in disaffiliating, using the language passed in 2553 as a guiding policy. And that is where we find ourselves today. The hope for unity that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians and elsewhere now, I think, will only come after a time of separation. And so we come to this regrettable but necessary crossroads. And I believe that the issue really has moved from a debate about human sexuality and the full inclusion of LGBTQ persons or not, from a debate on those issues to a matter of whether churches can live in the midst of disagreement or not. And those churches that can live in the midst of difference and disagreement will likely stay in the United Methodist Church, while those that cannot will disaffiliate. And that is the issue of disaffiliation. Disaffiliation is a church-initiated decision to explore separation from the United Methodist Church over convictions about human sexuality. This is not a split where two new bodies are formed. Hear me, this is not a split where two new bodies are formed. This is some churches seeking to separate themselves from the United Methodist Church, which will continue on in its present form for the foreseeable future. With the last announcement, which came on March 3rd, I just moved my page, there we go. So this in brief, let me move on to what the process is, just so you know. So next slide, there we go. This in brief is what the disaffiliation process looks like. Really, there are 8 steps in 4 movements, which you can see. A church expresses its interest and applies for disaffiliation is phase 1. The conference and church share pertinent information with each other, and then the church conference is held in that church where all members are gathered to vote on whether to disaffiliate or not. The bar is 2/3, so a church must vote in favor of disaffiliation by at least 2/3 in order for them to proceed. Finally, an agreement is worked out between the annual conference and the church, and the annual conference approves moving forward. Now, this process might change in the future, and here is what we know. The current process, governed by 2553 and supported at the time by those that supported the traditionalist plan, will expire at the end of next year. The Judicial Council has determined that this is the only process available until General Conference decides on a new process. And any new process would need to be approved in General Conference 2024. I don't think there is a clear consensus on what might happen in 2024, nor do I believe anyone else does either. So that's, in a sense, what the process is. Now, there's been a lot of chatter about what the United Methodist Church will be like in our future. And let me say what I believe will be true. First, we will remain biblically grounded. There is much disagreement on how we interpret Scripture, but it is the basis of our faith. The United Methodist Church will maintain that Holy Scriptures contain all things necessary for salvation. We will still find our identity in our articles of faith, rooted in the historic creeds of our church, the creeds that unite us with all of Christian tradition and Christian communities across the globe. In essence, we will remain Christian. Now, I raise this because there is stuff out there that says otherwise. There is stuff out there that says otherwise. Those are simply not true. To change the articles of faith in our denomination requires, at a minimum, 2/3 of General Conference to vote in favor of a change, and 3/4 of all United Methodists across the world to vote in favor of a change. When was the last time we got 3/4 agreeing on anything in this, in our current climate? So the fact is that the articles of faith, the basis of the faith in our church, are not going to change. They are rock solid. Finally, we will let our Wesleyan spirituality and our heritage guide us as we move forward. We will, as a conference leadership, we will work to remove from the discipline the restrictive language denying the LGBTQ community full inclusion in the life of our church, without forcing this desire for full inclusion upon any individual congregation. That will be what we work for. We have to do that through the work of General Conference at 2024 and at future General Conferences as needed. We will continue to work towards being made perfect in love as John Wesley sought for the people called Methodists. Now, we can expect that the United Methodist Church will undergo some changes. These changes will be carefully considered at future General Conferences in 24, 28, and 32. Certainly, there are going to need to be adjustments made to the budget of the General Church, including the general boards, agencies, and support for the episcopacy. There will likely be conversations similar to what is stated in the Christmas Covenant, which will seek to give larger regions like the United States and central conferences more autonomy in governance and statement of our beliefs. Our present structure was simply not created to govern a worldwide church that we have become. So these are necessary steps that I believe would have been needed regardless of the debate and the disaffiliation of some of our churches. But the heart of who we are as a Methodist movement will remain. So far, less than 3% of our churches worldwide have expressed an intent to disaffiliate. Less than 3% this year. Now, we will expect more next year. But still, that is far from a split down the middle of our church. In our conference, we expect less than 10% overall, and it could be much less than 10%. So now let me share a little bit about the future of our conference. In 2018, when the Mountain Sky Conference was formed, we chose this statement as our mission. The Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church will live in God's grace and abundance as we lead a re-energized, peaceful, and compassionate movement to claim the life-changing love of Jesus Christ for all people. For all people. Now, congregational vitality person speaking, do not pattern your mission statement after that one. That is like 5 times too long. However, it is a good statement, and one that I think speaks to who we want to be. Who we want to be. We want to be a church for all people, for progressive-minded people and conservative-minded people, for young, for elderly, for people in urban areas and people in rural areas, for people in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and even that one county in Idaho, for the LGBTQ community, for the people of other marginalized communities, for third-generation Methodists like myself and those who've never been to church before in their lives, and anyone and everyone in between. We're still living into this statement, but this is the mission that guides us. In United Methodism, the primary organization of the church is the annual conference, but the local church has always been the center for disciple making. Therefore, we understand that the annual conference is here to support the disciple-making efforts of our local churches. So we will continue to provide our churches with locally administered, consultative process of providing pastoral leaders through the appointment system, local conference staff ready to support your mission efforts, and administrative and with financial resources, administrative resources, ministry resources. As an example, right now, Michael Moore, a member of our conference staff, is helping us support the community affected by the tragic fire up in northern Colorado with a grant of $480,000 from UMCOR. Only the latest in many grants that we've received in the past 6 years to help our communities. We hope to provide a network of other congregations to draw support from one another and a way to be in mission well beyond our bounds through the missional connections of the United Methodist Church. Let me tell you about one other way that we intend to support those congregations and groups who choose to stay with us, and it's called A Table for All. To date, we have raised about $800,000 in gifts and pledges to help churches that are suffering through traumatic loss in this season, either because of disaffiliation, decisions, or other recent events. Support will include financial aid for a 3-year process to help congregations assess their new situation, make necessary changes, and lean into new identities through neighbor-centered ministry experiments. As imperfect as we are as a connection and as a family, I believe we will remain strong as a Mountain Sky Conference and a United Methodist family. In our conferences, 2 churches disaffiliated last June. 6 churches will disaffiliate this October. But right now, as I mentioned, I expect fewer than 10% of our churches, of our 368 churches, to disaffiliate. Perhaps much fewer. And of those that disaffiliate, not all will decide to join the Global Methodist Church. Most are choosing to simply remain community churches in their small communities. I want to end my comments where I began, with these words of admonition from Paul. The church, understood as the body of Christ, is central to my theology and I believe to our Methodist identity. We all hear Paul saying there is a diversity of gifts and functions. I believe Paul also understood that there was a diversity of theological perspectives too. After all, much like the letter you heard in church today, he was writing to a church in conflict. Did you know that every living body not only is diverse, but is in tension? Right now, my bones are in tension with my muscles, and my lungs are pressing against my rib cage, trying to take breath. It's how I work. It's how you work. It's how we live. We're not only diverse, we are in tension, in opposition at times. We as a church are going to disagree. We always have. Yet I still believe we are stronger together than separate. And I am thankful for Smoky Hill United Methodist Church's inclusion in our Mountain Sky family. You make us stronger. And so you remain in my prayers. And I will share with you my prayer, which has also been my mantra of my ministry since 2019 and in some ways before. It is my hope, and I will do all in my power to keep our conference, every district, and especially every church, as whole as possible. Prayers for us all. And so let's enter into a time of questions and answers. And because I understand this is being recorded, if you have questions, I'm going to invite you to come up and speak into the microphone. Come forward as you wish. Let's continue our conversation. No? Got a couple?
So for things, I can't tell. Oh.
There we go.
So for things, in like our day-to-day church stuff, things like gay marriages, would we have to wait until 2024 for that to be okay and that be part of that decision-making in 2024? Like what happens between now and 2024?
Right. It is, so two statements. One, it would be in the Book of Discipline. It would be forbidden in the Book of Discipline until 2024, or as such time as General Conference makes a change. But in our conference, we have chosen not to enforce those parts that we think are unjust. And per the protocol, that was part of the interim for the protocol was that we would not seek to move forward charges related to performing same-sex unions in church or by the pastors. So.
Hi, and
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. So there's a lot in the news about all these lawsuits that are going on. Can you speak to that as to why?
Right, I can speak to a little bit about that. So in General Conference 2019, paragraph 2553 was passed with the support of the traditionalist churches, but was passed with some requirements for disaffiliating. Among those requirements, churches had to pay a full amount of apportionments for 2 years. We are interpreting that to mean the past year and 1 future year. Also make up for unfunded pension liability for pastors that have served in the past. So this one's complex, but it is a large number for many of our congregations. We have a pension program for our pastors that assumes all the churches will continue to be open and pay into that pension program for the foreseeable future. It was not built for the idea of churches to leave. And so as a process, churches are assessed an amount that is their portion of what is unfunded to date, and they are required to pay that before they disaffiliate, right? So those are the two biggest numbers. There is also in some, there is language in 2553 that allows an annual conference to assess a portion or up to the full value of property for a church to disaffiliate. Some conferences are choosing not to assess any property value. Some conferences are choosing to assess a portion. I think the largest I've heard is up to 20%. That is the key sticking point, like in Florida and other places where there are now lawsuits, because that can be a sizable figure. So what churches are trying to do is argue with the trust clause that says that a church can't leave with its property, right? According to the Book of Discipline, we have been governed by what is called the trust clause, which says that you own this property, but it is in trust with the United Methodist Church. Hence, you cannot just simply take it with you. It is held in trust with the United Methodist Church, and so the United Methodist Church has a say in the disposition of your property. And so in some conferences, namely Florida, there is a lawsuit. I don't know all the details, the particulars, but there is a lawsuit basically challenging the trust clause and the actions of the annual conference to place any kind of financial burden on a church that's leaving. We'll see where it goes. 99, I think, percent of any challenges to the trust clause have been turned down in the court system to date. So the trust clause has had a legal tradition that's been fairly solid, but one never knows. So we are seeking to avoid that in our conference, and at present there are no churches that are seeking legal remedy to 2553. We do not charge 20% up front for every church. We do reserve the right to charge something based primarily on ministry potential for a United Methodist presence in that community. So if there's a church, and particularly a remnant group, one value we hold in our conference is if any church decides to leave, but there is a group within that church that wants to remain United Methodists, we want to support them. And that is in part what A Table for All was created for originally before the pandemic, was to support any group that wished to remain a part of the United Methodist Church in our conference, even though their church might disaffiliate.
I'm getting lost in the word disaffiliate.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these possibilities out there are wandering through, such as UMCOR, the name of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and I missed the Global or the United Methodist, but I can't think of any more details, but I know there are tons of them. I think Women of Faith is also a possibility about where that will be. Where is the, what are we, if we vote to disaffiliate, what does that look like in everyday stuff?
So first, let me state again that we're not talking about our organization as the United Methodist Church splitting and becoming two new things. That's not what we're talking about. The United Methodist Church is going to move on and continue in our life and generally in our structure. So things like UMCOR are going to remain our future. The Cross and Flame will remain ours until such time that we decide to change our logo ourselves, if that ever comes up, right? All of those things that define us as United Methodists stays with the United Methodist Church. All the general boards and agencies, all of the independent organizations like UMCOR. Now, there are a few organizations like United Methodist Women who I think are keeping the door open for relating to both the United Methodist Church and the new Global Methodist Church. So there may be some groups that choose to relate to both. Like Westpath. Westpath has the name Westpath because they were anticipating serving both groups. But they're still primarily a part of our church. And since the protocol is dying, I'm not sure Westpath will be serving the Global Methodist Church, actually. But when you see name changes, that's the idea, is that they may still choose to have some services with the new entity, the Global Methodist Church. Disaffiliation, in its most elemental state, disaffiliation is the choice of a single church to leave the denomination and the conference. And that's all it is. Now, what churches that leave do with their future is totally up to them, right? It's totally up to them. But that is the only decision that's being made with regard to our conference and the denomination at this point, is for individual churches to apply and meet the requirements and therefore become independent. Now, once they become independent, they can remain independent, they can join another denomination, they can join the new Global Methodist Church if they wish. That is up to them. They have to chart their own course from that point forward. Did that make sense? Sort of? It's complex, I understand. It's complex.
So I just wanted to clarify that as United Women in Faith, formerly known as United Methodist Women, that indeed was a real intentional move to become open to anybody. And you've never had to be a United Methodist to belong to the organization, but we're intentionally making it very clear. And are actually reaching out to this disaffiliating churches to see if the women who had previously been active in the group could still be in the group. The question I have is, could you speak to, I know the big fear was that the people of the central conferences had not wanted to be, had voted for the traditional church. And
Yes.
so can you speak to more why they've changed their mind?
I'm not as versed on this, but generally, I think that they were under the assumption that the traditionalist church, the traditionalist plan, was an option that would keep the church together. And therefore, when Wesley Covenant Association announced that the Global Methodist Church would be forming and would be splitting, they realized that what they were supporting was not achieving the ends they wish. And so it is my understanding, and in fact there was a statement recently by a group of the African bishops against some of the work of WCA within their areas that they thought was offering misleading information. So in essence, the African church still prefers a more traditional view overall. And that would have been their intent, but they also wanted the church to remain whole. And when they realized that that was no longer the goal of Wesleyan Covenant Association, they have many have since withdrawn their support in some significant ways.
If you don't mind, if I can add a little bit to that, just church unity is a huge value in many of our African conferences. If at General Conference, if you're there, you notice eventually when they're doing hand raised votes, you will eventually notice that many of the African delegations vote as one. And that is a cultural difference that is very evident. And so unity is a huge priority in just culturally in a lot of the central conferences that they're coming from. And so, once they saw that the traditionalist plan that in other ways acknowledged many of their values was not achieving that goal, it became much less attractive. And I think largely it sounds, from what I have been hearing lately, something along the lines of the Christmas Covenant has been getting more traction, which, if you don't know what we're talking about with that, it's a reference to nerdy Wesleyan history, but the idea is central conferences are actually free to change certain parts of the Book of Discipline to meet their cultural context. The United States is not. And this includes the part that we're debating right now.
Yep.
Right? So. Yeah, so when we're voting about whether or not we can ordain gay people, they're voting about something that they could actually change if they wanted to in their conferences. We can't. That's what that particular legislation would change, is it would give us the same sort of ability in the US to have our own culturally adapted book of discipline, the same, like in certain sections, the same way that a central conference does. So that is what that is, and at least to me, that's kind of been the most appealing for a long time, but seems like people might be finally starting to listen.
There's still a question about what parts need to change and what they're
Oh, yeah.
covered in that, though.
Definitely.
And that's one of the issues, is will the Christmas covenant
Yeah.
will the Christmas covenant achieve what we wish for? And we will have to see. So, yeah.
I don't think church legislation can achieve all my wishes.
Other questions?
Well, I'm still a little confused, but let me ask, a general kind of question. What do you think is going to happen in the Mountain Sky Conference in the next 2 years before the 2024 General Conference? And what do you think will happen after that? Just your best guess.
I mean, I think with regard to LGBTQ inclusion, we will continue to advocate it from a conference leadership perspective any way we can. That has been a historic position of our conference in general, but particularly our leadership for a long time. And so we do so within the limitations we have, and understanding in some sense the perils that are involved in that advocacy until the Book of Discipline is changed. But the Board of Ordained Ministry continues to accept LGBTQ persons into candidacy for ministry. We continue to move them forward through that process and ordain them if they've met all the other requirements expected. And we continue to, we do not, we have to address charges that are brought, but we try to do so in as least harmful way as possible, and to support clergy that wish to support the LGBTQ community in any way we can. My hope, as is the hope of many, is that in 2024, the restrictive language will be removed, which will allow for us to live more fully into our values as an annual conference. I think we continue to do that past 2024, no matter what. I think we will continue to work to make those changes in the discipline until we've made the changes necessary. We will find a way until at least that's what I sense at this point. For the rest of the work of the annual conference, I think we continue to move forward to support our churches as best we can in the ways that we can, especially in these times of change, and continue to provide the services and the leadership that we're responsible for, even in these challenging times. One thing we are waiting with bated breath in this moment is we expect Judicial Council to decide whether the delegates that were elected to 2020 General Conference will be the ones called upon to serve for 2024, or if we need to elect new delegates next year. That is still waiting or ruling, but I think we will continue to do what we have been. We are already making some of the changes that are necessary to make sure that we are a sustainable conference moving forward, even in the midst of these changes. At annual conference this next weekend, we will be voting on a budget that has $500,000 cut in our budget to make sure we're matching what we expect as far as income. So we are addressing some of the changes. Some of that is may be due to disaffiliation. Most of it is just due to the general decline many of our churches through the years. And that has nothing to do with what we've been through with regard to this issue. So that's my hope anyway. That's my hope of what we will look like in the next 2 years. But much changes, it's just, I get a knot in my stomach just saying this out loud. But jurisdictional conference, there is a potential for an Episcopal change here. That is a possibility. It would be a possibility again in 2024. Bishop Oliveto has expressed that she probably will not serve past 2024. I'm not even sure she's allowed to because of retirement age. But so, there will always be changes in our life together moving forward through these things, regardless of what happens in the midst of this. But what we can expect is 2024 is not going to divide us at wholesale into 2 new organizations because of WCA and the Global Methodist Church choosing to withdraw the way they are. So whatever future the United Methodist Church has will be our future for those of us that remain to decide upon.
Do you have an idea with a lot of the churches disaffiliating if we have the support to make the changes in the Book of Discipline? And are there progressive churches that are disaffiliating as well?
Presently, we do not have any progressive churches disaffiliating from our conference. I think that number is exceedingly low. I think the best path forward for allowing the full inclusion of LGBTQ community in the American church is something along the lines of the Christmas Covenant, which allows for a system of regional autonomy regarding matters of leadership and matters of social principles in this way, and which would allow us to live into our values more fully and allow central conferences the ability, probably more so, to live into the values that they have more fully. I think that's probably that's the easiest path forward towards our goals for full inclusion in the American church. Other than that, I think it would be a high bar to impose fully inclusive values on churches in Africa or the Philippines or other places. And I think that they would be resistant to that, and it would be hard for us to get the votes to pass that. All right. Well, thank you all for your time. It is no small investment to spend a good portion of your Sunday for this conversation, so I appreciate it very much. I'm going to hang around in the back. If you have any personal questions or one-on-one questions you would have for me, I'd be happy to engage with you in those. Otherwise, I wish you well, and know that I and all of our conference staff, but I am here to support you. I didn't share this in the beginning of my work, but my day job is not to do these speeches. My day job is to provide vitality resources for established congregations and to help support new faith communities across our area. And it's something I love to do, and if ever you find a need for such services, please be in touch with me. In the meantime, God bless you all.